This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of guys with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 291, Automation and DevOps. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're going to talk about the benefits of automation and how to get started. I'm Nick, and today joining me, as usual, is Stephen Cross with Parallax Info Technology. What's new with you this week?
Hey guys, glad to see everyone. We're recording a little later in the week this week. It's a Friday, huh? I guess I'm happy. I guess I'm happy it's Friday. What's new with me? Did some Drupalcon last week. This week, just kind of catching up on a lot of work. So I would say there's like nothing shockingly new.
Steven, is that your first Drupalcon?
Yeah, right. It is my first Drupalcon.
Is it really?
Yeah, it is.
Oh wow.
Yeah, yeah, it's a surprise, huh?
Wow.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk about Drupalcon a little bit lower in the show notes here. But I have some thoughts about it, about being virtual too. So I've been to my first Drupalcon and a number of Drupal camps that had been virtual and non-virtual. And I'm looking forward to getting back in person. So I guess we'll see where NedCamp goes, but really not a whole lot new with me this week. Happy to be vaccinated. I'm past my 14-day vaccination. My sister came and visited me last weekend. Hadn't seen her since last July. So it was kind of nice to get back in the swing of things.
Very nice. Yeah, I think we're going to start hearing a lot of that in the next couple of months. Also joining us this week, Mike Miles with MIT. What's new with you this week?
MIT Sloan.
Yeah, so I was going to say Sloan, but in my mind, said Sloan Kettering, which is Jacob, and I knew that wasn't you. So I didn't want to say Sloan, and then so I kind of cut off because I knew the MIT part was correct.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah, I mean, I went to DrupalCon last week as well. Went to, and some of the summits this week. I agree. I have comments on the format. But one of the things learned last week was how DDev, if anybody uses that for local development, their sort of the business side of that is going away. So the company Druid behind it is still going to be on, but they're not going to put company resources on it anymore, which DDev is open source, so you can still use it. It just, that cautions me that they really need the community to step up and help support it. Randy Fay said he's still going to be there doing it, but I'm sure he's going to have, other things he has to focus on. So
Mike, I never used, well, I played with DDev and it was the only interface, the only tool I got to work on a Raspberry Pi for Drupal development. Not that I recommend anyone do that, but they were the only one that was ARM supported when I tried it maybe a year ago. So isn't DDev the focus of it? I always felt the focus of it was to a front end to a hosting service.
Well, that's DDev Live, and that's what's shutting down. They'll host it and they'll do it, but then there's DDev Local, which is basically just a wrapper around Docker container, it's Docker container management.
Yep.
So the same thing Doxel does or Lando.
Right. So the front end piece is still, the open source piece is still live. It's the hosted side that's going away.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. But that, to me, that just cautions that how much they're going to focus on it. Yeah. So. And it's what me and my team use for our local development and as part of our CI process as well. So,
do you guys envision yourself moving?
I don't know. We'll see. I personally spent a whole bunch of time the last year getting it working very well for our stack. So I don't want to spend that time going back to Doc. I mean, I like Doc, so that's what I used to use, and I could go back to that or Lando or something. But if I need to, we will. But we'll see what the cards.
Yeah, if it hasn't broken yet.
Yeah, right. I mean, I just even up to yesterday, I got something for it working very near perfectly as we needed to. So I'll let it run its course.
I mean, I can't wait to hear about that in this show, right?
Yeah. Oh, and I'm wearing, let's see, for those watching, I'm wearing I love DevOps. I got my I love DevOps shirt. So
There you go.
That's a nice shirt.
yeah, you gotta love, that's the conference swag, man. Half my t-shirts are conference swag. More than half, probably 75%.
I'm always interested because with the digital conferences, you never know what's going to come, right? Like if you're at a real physical conference, you can see the swag while you're picking it up. But basically at the virtual conferences, you're just filling out a form. So
yeah, or then you forget and you get something in the mail, like, oh, I got a Pantheon t-shirt. Oh, I got snacks from somebody. Okay.
Also joining us this week, as usual, John Picozzi from Oomfink. What's new with you this week?
Well, I upgraded my Pantheon site to Drupal 9. I talked about that, I think in last week's episode, like I said in the pre-show, weeks run together. So, so I had, at Drupalcon, I had asked them about that and gotten a tutorial on their website about how to upgrade to Drupal 9 on Pantheon. Turns out they have an upstream for it. The upstream is composer based, which is awesome. So I think the article it was in the show notes last week, has the link to the directions that I used. At the top of that, there's a link to the upstream. So when you go into the Pantheon dashboard, it still shows Drupal 8 and Drupal 7, doesn't show, or Drupal 8 and WordPress or whatever. It doesn't show the upstream for Drupal 9. This link allows you to install a Drupal 9 instance to your dashboard. And then from there, I actually kind of just did the process a little bit manually, I guess. I downloaded my database and my files from my current site. I pulled everything down into Lando, was working locally in Lando, and then added my database and files. Re-added my modules that I was using with Composer, and was off to the races, good to go. Everything worked. Best part about it is because I'm using Pantheon's D9 upstream, I'm actually able to use the dashboard to update my site again, which is nice because switching to Composer on Drupal 8 broke that feature pretty catastrophically. So it's awesome. I think the hardest part was kind of wrangling the billing side of things to get, my new plan set up. But it was cool. I'm thinking about doing a how-to video on it. I'm not sure if anybody'd be interested in that, but if you are interested, reach out and I will put that together.
Someone's always interested, John.
I'm interested.
Yeah, someone's always interested.
Yeah, is it still a process you had to set up another Pantheon account and kind of basically move your site over, or were you able to upgrade the existing?
No. I think right now there is no upgrade path from an existing to stay on that existing site. I had to set up a new site and kind of migrate to that new site. And I actually did that because, I feel like personally it's cleaner, but I don't think there's a migration path for current sites right now.
Very cool. And this week for me, I've been under a big crunch for a client to get some user testing set up. And I had the opportunity to sit in on one of the sessions this morning. I would highly recommend anybody who's working on something with user testing, if you have the opportunity, sit in. It's mind-blowing the amount of stuff that you can get out of just seeing, kind of observing somebody that isn't familiar with your site navigate around and interact with it. And the questions that they come up with, they kind of challenge some very basic assumptions that you sometimes make. So highly recommend it. I have to say too, for this particular user testing process, usually, there was a pretty big pivot about a week and a half before it went live. So I ended up doing some of the ugliest, worst coding and Drupal work that I've ever done in my career. It was very hack and slash, but it was kind of liberating too. I didn't have to, it was very much proof of concept type work, which is sometimes refreshing, but we just had to kind of get a separate site up. The site's being thrown away after, the 2 weeks of user testing. It wasn't any type of environment that was ever going to be live. So being able to kind of just like dig in and make changes, it really showed me how some parts of the internals of Drupal work that, really don't interact with too often. And, I end up having to build multiple themes in order to render certain things. Like it was really interesting to kind of dig into the library system as deep as I had to get certain things working. And it certainly illuminated some ways I could improve some things I was doing kind of all along. So, it was definitely an interesting couple of weeks, a lot of work, but even just the one session I sat in on, I think we're going to get a lot of really good information out of the sessions, and going to have a lot of improvements for our users over the next couple of months. So looking forward to seeing what comes out of that.
It's interesting. I just envisioned Nick sitting there during the user tests going like, the button's right there. Just click the button. What are you doing?
No, I kept myself muted. But yeah, no, that's the thing. Like you realize how often people actually go to the footer to find stuff that's already in the header and on the page 3 other times. But but it's also interesting because, each person that I saw that, for the particular piece of information that people kept going to the footer for, they found it immediately in the footer. That doesn't, it was also in the header, but the fact that they found it within a couple of seconds means that, the fact that it's in the footer is helpful and it should stay there. It doesn't mean necessarily that you need to make it more prominent in the header because they found it, but it also pointed out like, hey, some other information that people needed on the page just wasn't there, and they could, or it was there, but they ended up clicking in 4 or 5 different places and like leaving pages that had the information they were looking for. So, if you've ever done user testing, that's pretty par for the course. But it's always interesting to see it on a project that's never had user testing before, and see what kind of assumptions get called out.
Pretty awesome that the project you're working on, they set aside time and effort to do user testing as well.
I wouldn't say that they set aside time as much as decided last minute they wanted to do it and then gave us a week and a half to get it together. Like there was talk before, but then like, oh yeah, we decided we're going to do it. It's going to start April 15th. Yeah. Like you realize today's April 1st. Is that April Fool's? and that's why there was a lot of that kind of, kind of old school cowboy coding. But like I said, it was very much on a separate environment, and and it worked. I mean, we're definitely getting valuable information out of the user testing. It's definitely not code that I'll show anybody in a professional setting ever, but I think we got what we needed. Okay, so we've got one story this week. I saw an article the other day from FOSS-Post. I think it's free open source software post.org, talking about the Linux kernel this past week. As we all know, the Linux kernel is an open source project, and the article was about one of the core maintainers for Linux, the Linux kernel, banned an entire university from making contributions. I believe it was the University of Minnesota. And essentially the university decided to run an experiment to see how easy it would be to introduce vulnerabilities into an open source project surreptitiously. And they did it. So basically they were simulating, a red team pen testing on a code base. But they did it in a pretty unethical manner. They didn't notify the project heads. They just kind of put code in random projects that was known malicious or didn't fix the problem, it was broken, and tried to track how often they were able to get it in. Now, I think it's interesting. I think it's definitely a topic that needs to be discussed and researched. I think it's, it is open source software. It's good to know if it's vulnerable to this sort of attack. But I think it's definitely interesting to see how they approached it, because they basically just submitted patches that had malicious code in it. And some of those patches got merged into certain branches. So they didn't even have proper safeguards in to make sure that their broken or incomplete software didn't make it into production environments. And then they didn't even do proper notification after the fact. They kind of just released their paper, and that's how the Linux kernel maintainers found out about it. So, to be fair to the maintainers, some of the stuff did get flagged and questioned, but they did find out that some of the stuff was still kind of in branches and code bases. The way that they found out that the team had done this was they saw the paper and read it and said, hey, wait a second, and then did some discovery and found, oh, hey, there's a bunch of commits here that look like they took part of that pattern. And so they took the measure, they reverted every commit by anybody from the University of Minnesota and banned them permanently from ever contributing to the project.
Wow.
I was gonna troll you and Steven and ask if you could tell us more about what Linux is, but instead I'll ask a real question. I mean, based on this, right? So like anybody could do this with any kind of open source software, right? Do you think something like this is a benefit or a detriment to, the open source community?
I mean, I think the way the study was handled was unethical. I think the premise behind the study is definitely that's something that would be beneficial and useful to study. I think people will use it as an alarm to say, hey, open source isn't safe. People can commit bad stuff. But the truth is that can happen with closed source too, except you don't have the benefit of ever seeing those changes because it's closed source. So yeah, I think it's definitely something that should have been researched. I don't think it was approached in the correct manner.
I think it's a regular process to do it. Is it not a regular process or common practice?
I think it is.
To do it in an ethical way and to notify the maintainers that it's happening.
Because I can say I've had people reach out to me for like my code bases and ask permission if like they can run a scan, like try to use XPath or something to like get data they're not supposed to get, and asked if they could do that, and they'll let me know if there's any security vulnerabilities they come up against. So I think Nick's right. It's how they approach doing it, which was bad.
Yeah, there's and that's where a lot of the criticism was that if they had gone to one of the comments that I read about it was if they had gone to one single security conference, they would have learned that there's industry standard practices for doing this kind of thing. Yeah. And they didn't follow a single one. So yeah, like it's definitely, and it goes beyond pen testing. It's a little bit different because they're trying to commit malicious code, whereas pen testing is trying to break existing code. But yeah, I think it is a crucial thing to study and test. I also agree that the Linux Foundation or the Linux kernel maintainers' actions are perfectly reasonable. I mean, they already do an enormous amount of highly specialized, difficult work, and now they have to take who knows how many hours to like revert all these and check all these commits and see if they actually fix the issues or not. Because that's the thing too. Not every commit from them was malicious or bad, right? Some of them were legitimate. So now we're going to get regressions because we can't trust the source.
Right. Yeah, and I think what happens in a open source community like this is when a particular committer gets a reputation of doing good work, that committer could sneak in bad work because of their reputation, right?
Yep.
And that's kind of what they did, right? They used their reputation as a way to sneak things in that were not good, which is pretty malicious.
I also see I don't see value in submitting bad stuff, right? But I see that as being the value of open source, right? Somebody else has got to look at that and validate, like, yes, you are doing good. Now, whether that somebody else is within your organization and you have the ability to manipulate them, that's a different story. But moving right along. So 3 out of 4 of us attended DrupalCon last week, and some of us attended some of the DrupalCon summits this week, and I'm sure we'll attend some of them next week. I have thoughts about DrupalCon, but I would be interested to hear. First of all, I'm interested to hear Steven's thoughts, seeing as it was his first DrupalCon. It was in a virtual format, but first DrupalCon nonetheless. So, Steven, what do you got?
So my comments are a little tainted in a little bit because I struggled a little bit with the opportunity that I had to go to DrupalCon. So I bought a ticket, but I didn't have a clear go ahead. I wasn't going to take a week off to attend everything. So I had a choice of, if I attended something, I need to make up time on the project I was working on. So it wasn't a, hey, jump in and enjoy the conference fully for me, because I'm not going to take 4 or 5 days off for this. If it's virtual, right? I got other stuff I need to do. I'll keep my vacation time or my away time for other things, which is, I guess, a problem with the virtual conference, right? If this thing was, I think it was supposed to be in Boston, wasn't it?
Yeah, it would have been Boston. Yeah.
If it was in Boston this week, it does bring up a question for me. Would I have taken the vacation time to go?
That was going to be my question.
Yeah. And you know what? I may have, but because I was physically removing myself and removed all my responsibilities, but it was difficult for me to take the time the way I wanted to take it. So I attended a number of sessions, but I don't think I fully got to experience even the virtual conference because of the limitations that I had. So not necessarily certainly not a comment about DrupalCon itself, more of my approach to the virtual conference was pretty unsatisfying to me. Because I could see, because the first day I did spend a majority of the day and I was jumping into the networking stuff, and I could see myself easily sort of spending a lot of time in that side of the conference, sort of interacting with people, but then realized, hey man, I can't take 3 days off here. This is just going to get crazy. So I would jump in, take a session, and then immediately sort of get out of it to save myself time. And I don't think that's probably the best way to do it.
No, I mean, I think I found myself doing a little bit similar. I did try to block my schedule to be able to, participate as much as I could, but there were still, there were still instances where things came onto my schedule that I had to kind of take a break and do, and people were asking questions and whatnot. So yeah, I can kind of understand that. If you're not, if you don't have professional growth time or some sort of mechanism to be able to kind of divorce yourself from, your required work, then that can definitely be difficult.
I mean, it's also harder to do just in general for the virtual conferences because you're sitting there on your, probably on your work computer, right? So the emails are coming in, the Slack messages are coming in, and it's harder to have the excuse to not respond to them. I mean, I 100% agree with both of you saying. I felt the same way. Just there are other things where, because I wasn't going anywhere, I couldn't say, oh, I can't go to this meeting because I'm at DrupalCon, unless, in years past when I was actually at DrupalCon, where I could just focus on that.
It's interesting because when you're at a physical conference, right, even though you're typically on your laptop while you're listening to a session, right, you have that chance where you close your laptop to walk in between session rooms, or you close your laptop to walk to a social event or something like that, and you don't have that distraction. So Mike, I'm going to pivot to you because I think you and I have some of the same recommendations or issues. Issues is a strong word, but we'll that's the best one I can come up with right now about the DrupalCon. So how was your experience?
It was mixed. For the things we just talked about, where I had a bunch of work priorities that kept stealing me away. But I also, and this is what we share, is the way the schedule is laid out didn't work the best for me. Not knowing what to go to, where to find things, being able to jump. I mean, I guess the benefit of virtual is that if I went to a session and I wasn't really feeling it, it was quick and easy to jump out and jump into something else instead of like having to give up my chair and go to another room. And
you don't feel as
stand in the
bad
back.
because you're like halfway through the speaker's presentation, you're standing up and you're walking out. You're like, that's just not nice, right?
But there were a couple of things I did enjoy. Surprising for myself, one of the highlights was, for the Boston Drupal group, we had a Drupal event, part of DrupalCon or Drupal Fest for this month of April. And it was after the DrupalCon, the first day, Tuesday. And it was our regular meetup, but it was just like we called it a tea party. So we allowed anyone at DrupalCon to come and join us. And we had a large number of people. And it's like, I played background music and it's just people talking and hanging out. And that felt the closest to actual in-person DrupalCon to me. Cause it's like, we're all just joking around and talking. And I didn't know I needed that, but afterwards I felt really good going into Wednesday.
Yeah, I even got in on that, and it was great because I actually went and then I had to go and then I tried to come back later, but everybody had already signed off, and I was kind of like, missed out, but that's all right. Yeah, I think the hardest part for me was the schedule. I think it was the DrupalCon schedule itself, and having it seemed like 10-minute, 15-minute, 30-minute and 45 or an hour long sessions, like those different blocks of time. Like I really struggled to kind of make a schedule that I could kind of go through the day with. And then, Mike and I both have taken part in some of the summits, and some of the summit schedules have a lot of duplicate sessions, which is like kind of confusing because how do you need 3 layout builder versus paragraph sessions? Let's combine those together. But I mean, I think the session content that I did see was great. I just wonder, did you guys have any feelings on the length of the sessions?
The short ones I felt were too short. 15 minutes. It was just not enough time to get into anything of substance. Mm-hmm. And I also, being one of the speakers as well, I didn't have a 15-minute slot, but I don't know if everyone was aware that it was supposed to be 15 minutes. So people had to retool what they were going to talk about and how they talked about it. I would have preferred to have at least the half-hour ones and the 45-minute ones. Not
to drone on, but I think the break between sessions too didn't feel long enough to me. It felt like it could very easily go from one session to another session to another session and not really stop for a good amount of time. And I don't know if that was intentional or just the way I'd kind of shown interest in what I was going after. But I do look forward to in-person next year.
So Mike, as a speaker, how did you think, what your impressions from that side of it?
It was all right. The organizers did their best what they could do. In some of the trainings, the speaker trainings for Hopin, I think messaging came a little late, literally 2 days before the conference started, about what tools recommended you use to turn on captioning. It was recommended to use Google Slides, but people had already built their presentations in Keynote, and with 2 days before the conference, you're not going to rebuild it. So yeah, just timing of messaging probably could have been better. But overall, I felt prepared and that I was given the help I needed and the support I needed. So
actually, you had a BOF, right?
Yeah, I had a BOF this year. So
how did that format go?
I thought it went really well.
You had hundreds of people in your BOF.
Yeah. Didn't I talk about it on last?
I think so. Right. Yeah.
275 people or something. I don't know. Having only 9 slots to speak, I think also helps with a BOF because, if you've been in an in-person BOF, there are people who don't feel like or aren't comfortable getting up to speak. And then some people who do kind of dominate the conversations. So having spots where people roll in and out, I think helped control that. And I definitely felt like I had more control as a facilitator than I might have in an in-person one.
Interesting. One last point question. What did you guys think of the Hopin platform? I personally think it's one of the better virtual event platforms that I've seen in the last, year, but I'm interested to see what you guys think.
It's the second time I've used it. I don't know how it's better than Zoom, Slack, frankly. I don't really see the advantage of it. I find it confusing for someone who's not like been in Hopin a few times.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I like it better than GatherTown, which some of the other conferences have used. Not to knock that, but that's just not my preferred tool.
Isn't that the one that looks like a video game?
Yeah. I don't know. It feels a little, and this is just my opinion, it feels a little juvenile to me.
You can send complaints to Mike Miles at.
Yeah, I don't want to. I don't want to knock anyone who's using it, because there's plenty of people it helps with engagement. I'm just not one of those people. I'd have no incentive to go in there and build a character and walk around virtually. I'll just go into the session list and click on the room and go to that.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I'm a boring person, so.
So I'm not going to use that segue. Moving on to this week's topic, we're going to be talking about automation and DevOps. So Mike, at least in the Boston area, in the Drupal world, I think you've started to become known as somebody who talks a little bit about continuous integration and automating workflows. Can you tell us a little bit about where that interest came from?
I definitely can. So my interest in automation and development workflows and continuous integration comes from me being a lazy developer. I don't want to spend my time repeating tasks and screwing them up when I don't have to. So, and I also don't want the people I work with to have to waste their time on things that don't deliver any sort of value when we can have robots do it for us. So I'm a lazy developer. I'm a person who always takes the escalator or the elevator instead of walking up the stairs.
Do you walk up the escalator?
Depends on how much of a hurry I'm in. Though, I mean, I haven't been on an escalator in a year, so.
That's true. Me either.
I'll just, next time I get a chance to ride on it, I'll relish it and just be like,
Mike, would you also call yourself a tinkerer? Because I find that people who like the DevOps stuff, I mean, I don't think it can't be just someone who's lazy, right?
No.
It also has to be someone who likes to tinker and kind of get into the weeds of things a little bit, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I like that because and I think this goes to heart to any developer, is that I like when I build a deployment, and like I just spent like 2 weeks retooling some part of our automated deployment, which is way too much time I should have spent on it. But every time I got a little bit further, I was like, oh, this is so amazing. This works. I can't believe I got it to work. Like I thought I could do this. And then last week I was doing peer programming with my team to get some of our BHAT tests to work. And I was writing it. We were doing it with screen share. I'm like, all right, I'm going to run this in our environment. I know it's not going to work. And then it worked. Like I literally put my hands in the air. I was like, I can't believe that worked. That's so amazing.
And then did you immediately think of like, this is going to save 8,000 hours over the next year?
No, then I thought, I was like, all right, this is how we can optimize what we just did. Let's redo it. So tinkering and automating, and I don't know.
So what is automating then? So when you say you're automating some process, what does that mean in a practical sense?
I mean, to me, automating is taking out the manual steps a person has to do and letting the machines do it for you in a repeatable fashion.
So do you consider things automated when you have to trigger them?
No. Like if you have to trigger a script or something to run, but all the tasks within there, like you've removed all those steps you have to do. So, I mean,
so the reason why, the reason why I'm making that distinction, I guess the point I'm trying to get to is, for a lot of my clients, when I set up a deployment automation workflow, I fully automate the development environment, right? I'll set up so that you push to the development environment, it builds a development environment. But the production environment, I don't automate that. So I automate the actual production deployment, but there's always some sort of manual gate to that production deployment going out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that gets into thinking about what to automate and when. Because
Okay.
I think we can talk more about that. It's just when you have to make a decision when it benefits you to kind of take your hands off the wheel and let the Tesla drive itself.
Ooh.
Ooh.
Oh yeah, I guess that. Sorry, I didn't think that went through. But so like what I try to pay attention to is when it's time to automate something is it goes back to the dry principles. You don't repeat yourself. If I find myself repeating the same 6 drush scripts, like drush commands, like multiple times a day, I'm gonna at very least write a bash script that I can run once that will run those 6 things for me, so I don't have to waste that time to do it again. And I think the complexity is just how you grow that, what you're repeating, and then how you can stop yourself from having to do that, like reduce those steps so that they can just be repeated by a machine that will do it the same way every time.
Yeah, I think there's kind of 2 different thresholds for me for when to automate. One is kind of like what you just said. If I'm doing something fairly often and it takes multiple steps, I'll definitely look to automate that. The second place that I look for automation really is if it's something that I don't do very often, but I have to look something up to remember how to do it, even if it's fairly simple.
Yep.
Like if it's something I have to do once every 6 months or 8 months or a year, and it's like each time I do it, I just can't quite remember the syntax of some command. Then I'll usually find a way to automate that. So I can, I'm still not like running that process isn't automated. I still have to remember to run it, but I no longer have to look up the syntax because I just kind of have to like push a button or run a script or something.
That's like anything that's a pain to do.
Yeah.
Like, because that what you're right describing there, right? Is like, like, all right, I'm just gonna make an example. Like, I got to reindex, my Solar database. All right, what's the connection info again? Where's the username and password? What commands do I have to pass? Like, you look that up and you run it. Maybe you do that manually once, every 2 months. But
is that automating it? I'm not sure that's the kind of automation we're really talking about. I think are we talking more about like things that are being done repetitively as opposed to things that are complicated and take a lot of syntax to do that you run once every 6 months? I wouldn't necessarily call that automation. I guess.
I mean, that's a hard distinction.
It is, right.
It's like a distinction between automation in the true sense and like just creating a shortcut in your like command line to do something that
I mean, and we talked about this a lot in the home automation episode, but I mean, I think that is automation. I mean, the trigger isn't automated because you still have to run the script, but you wrote a bash script that does all that stuff automatically once you run it. So I mean, I land on the side that it is automation, although it's not fully automated. I mean, maybe fully automating it is integrating it with like Jenkins or some kind of cron job, so it runs every 2 months, no matter what, right? And then you never have to think about it.
So like you trigger it off like a Slack message or something like that, a Slack bot.
So I'm curious here, how many of you guys have scripts on your computers right now so you can type in 1 or 2 letters to just do a git status? Instead of typing GIT space status, you just do a GS.
I use Z Shell and it has those built in.
Okay.
I do have one to unlock files because sometimes files will get locked on my computer, and instead of like writing out the whole like commands to change the file permissions, I created a shell.
Well, so I'll answer your question, but I have a follow-on. So yes, I have one for like fetching all branches and rebasing, not for status itself. But I misspell status so often that I should. What about something I actually update my shell to like tell me, for example, which branch I'm on, how many commits ahead or behind of origin it is. So I kind of think that that's a sort of automation because it removes the need to. I mean, it's not really a script, but it's removing the need from you to even run like git branch or git get status to
That's
see
just
where
an
you are.
efficiency. That's not an automation.
That's what automation
Yeah.
is. It's an
Inefficient. It's like preventing you from having to run a task or do a task
I don't know. I think
that's repetitive.
I think an efficiency is like, having multiple displays and having like a dashboard on a display. That's not an automation, right?
But
automation is like, hey, I just pushed this branch and now a whole bunch of stuff is going to happen behind the scenes.
So I just type these two characters into my terminal, and all this stuff is going to happen. Like it's a different degree.
But that's not what he's
automation.
talking about. He's talking about visually being able to see something on his screen, so that way he doesn't have to type a command to see it.
Yeah, but that's like every time I do something in the command line, it updates
in an effort not to turn this into the mammoth home automation show. We're gonna jump into some examples here because I think
especially Drupal related. Let's go.
We're all talking really theoretically, which is great, but let's jump into some automation examples and things that we typically like to automate. So I think we already talked about the first one, right? Development environment refreshes, like somebody pushes a branch to GitHub, GitLab, whatever the Git repository is, and like something happens, right? And on the development environment.
Yeah, I actually it's funny that you say that because I'm the one that put that bullet point in, and I was thinking the opposite direction. I was thinking more of refreshing your local development environment, because like pulling down the latest database, sanitizing the database, changing the stage of the database, and then running a configuration import. I have some clients where you have to disable a bunch of modules or point varnish at different places. Like I have some clients where it's like, manually, it used to be a 15-20 minute process to get your local environment refreshed and back up to space. So usually that's the first thing I automate is the ability to refresh my local environment. And sometimes that's as simple as, just having a Lando command that just runs whatever it needs to do. But in other cases, it's pulling down all the latest backup of the database, importing it, and running a bunch of bash commands to make sure things are, or drush commands to make sure things are set up for the local environment.
I have Nick. It's not the first thing I get set up, but it's the same thing. I have stuff that goes both ways, right? So it's like for my team, before to refresh your local, you had to pull down the database, you had to sanitize it, you had to make sure you run the database updates in the right order, you had to rebuild the theme. So now there's a script where you tell it, and you can tell it which environment you want to pull a database from, and it'll do all the proper commands to do that for you, and it'll refresh, do configuration import and all that for you. So it's a lot quicker, and people don't remember how to do it. At the same time, what you're saying, John, when someone pushes a pull request, we have automated tasks that then spin up a development environment for QA to use that has those changes in it, and it pulls the database as well. It's pretty similar. It's just a different location to run the script.
So then after you've kind of like, either done the pull down to your local or pushed up to a development environment, right? So you can automate your production deployments. And typically, I think we're going to talk about testing in a little bit, but like typically those production deployments kind of maybe go through a couple of steps, go through some tests, go through some, regression testing, that sort of thing. And all that stuff can be automated, right?
Yeah. And especially for Drupal and the common like service providers, you can do a lot of that for them in pretty similar ways. If you're using Pantheon or Platform or Acquia, or like Contigix even, you can do that. There's different degrees in what other tools you use to set those up, but you can definitely get it. So you probably for production deployment, you have, unless you're doing continuous deployment, you have somebody who's like the release manager who at least triggers it to go ahead and do all those changes and push to production.
Yeah, I know typically with Acquia, you gotta make a switch in the dashboard there to which branch is on production. But
yeah, but there's commands you can run to trigger those.
Yeah, and you don't have I think it's similar to Pantheon. Like the production environment actually just looks at a specific tag.
Yeah.
So you can actually, for example, in Pantheon, a lot of people don't know this. You can just tell the production environment to look at a specific tag, and you don't even have to go through the deployment process. Although,
yeah, I mean, I think that's a good. I think you mentioned it, Nick. That's a good gate to put up, right? If you have to make a concerted effort to change the tag that production is on, but everything else is done for you, right? That tag setup is just really you making sure that you're ready or looking at it when you're doing that.
Yeah, and you can really set up for like the production releases too, which if you have a human doing every step for it, humans get tired and lazy. And it may be like you want to make sure you get a database backup before you deploy in case something goes wrong, and you can restore. So you can set up these automated tasks that basically do all those steps for you. I mean, it's up to you most of the time to write those steps, but to make sure, like, all right, we do a backup of the production database, we deploy, to our we switch our tag, we run database updates, configuration imports, and if that fails at all, we're just going to roll back our database. And
yeah, I mean that all makes the less you can take, the more you can take the human element out of it, the better off I think you are, right? And that's one of the keys of automation. So let's move on. We just talked about testing. Let's talk about testing a little bit more. So like there are a bunch of different tests you can do. I don't know that we have to get into like the weeds, but some very basic, right? You can do linting on your code, say, hey, you got an error on line, blah, 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 and unit tests to, verify functionality. And then, behavioral tests to see, make sure things are still working correctly. Any other types of tests that you guys typically run when automating?
Visual regression tests.
Yeah, I was just adding that visual regression tests.
Yeah, I mentioned that earlier and then left it off the testing list. But yeah, basically, I think those are pretty important too, to highlight any issues. Now, let me ask you this. Typically, you're probably not doing those on a production automation. You're probably doing them on a staging automation, or are you doing them in both to verify that, something hasn't gone sideways between the staging and production environments?
I mean, I do them a bit on both, and I mean, there's different schools of thought on how to do this. Most of it, like the linting, for example, for code linting, I have that happening when like a PR opens, and it happens before we even get to a development environment or anything. You depending if you're using GitLab or GitHub or Bitbucket, you can set up tasks there that will do the linting for you, or you can even do pre-commit hooks with Git to do linting, which I have that in place as well. But then for when we spin up basically a development environment, then we run, after linting, we run the unit tests, we run the behavior tests, and we run the regression tests. When we do the production and deployment, we actually don't run the tests because everything that's going to production should have already run through all these to be able to be merged into the master. But what I do have set up is a nightly regression test, which I call it regression test, which will take a copy of the production site, put it in a dev environment, like matching all the production settings, and it'll run all our unit tests, behavior tests, and visual regression tests there as a nightly, just a catch all, just in case.
Does it ever catch anything?
No, it hasn't caught anything yet, because everything
good.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Everything gets caught in those pull requests in the dev environments, and having all the testing automated there, so it runs every time.
You raise an interesting point though here in like doing your linting before you get to a dev environment, and like where and when you do these tests, right? Because with automation, you could also over automate or over test your workflow, right? Where, maybe you're doing more testing than you need to, or you're doing testing in a duplicative manner, which is eventually is taking more time, right?
Yep.
So you want to kind of be very thoughtful at how and when you're doing your testing, and how and when you're integrating that into your automation.
Yeah, and
I just honestly need to know who's doing more testing than they need to. I don't think I've ever seen that on a project where too much tests are.
I guess my point is if you lint the code before it goes to development, right? And then maybe you do it again before it goes to staging. Do you really need to do it before it goes to production?
Oh, yeah.
There shouldn't be any code changes there, right?
Yeah.
So if you were doing that would be basically over testing your.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and that comes into, and we'll probably mention this later on, but when you're like refining your automation processes, depending what services you're using, it costs you money, right? If you use like Circle CI, you get build minutes and then you have to pay for more. So you want to figure out what's almost the minimum you need to do to cover as much as you can and not waste that
minimum
build time.
viable automation.
Yeah, well, it also wastes people times too, right? If it's like,
Yep.
if you have to run all these tests for a production deployment, that makes your deployment take 20 minutes. Then if you catch a bug, it's at least another 20 minutes before you can fix that bug.
Yeah, and at the extreme end, I know that Oracle's build test process takes over 48 hours. So people fix a bug, push up to the regression test, and 2 or 3 days later they get the report, and have to then work on it again to fix whatever they broke in their push.
So let the lesson here be: don't be like Oracle. So, up to this point, we've really been talking about automating, like a CI/CD pipeline, automating your workflow, right? As far as your kind of like technical, or your development workflow, right? But you can also automate project workflows and tasks, right? So let's talk a little bit about some of those. Do you guys have any examples of those tasks?
Yeah. So for my team, so we use Jira for our project management, and Jira has automation actions that you can add and you can build. And so one of them I have is like when we do our backlog grooming, and our estimating of like story points, as soon as we add story points to a ticket from a certain backlog, it moves it into the ready for sprint planning.
Oh, okay.
So like that doesn't do too much, but it removes the burden from like our project manager from having, after a backlog grooming session, to have to remember, all right, which ones do I need to move in for sprint planning? Right. Same as related, during our sprint, we have a swim lane for when tickets need code reviews, when a PR is open and it's ready for being reviewed. So we have a Jira task. When the ticket moves into the code review column, it sends a Slack message to our dev channel to say, hey, ticket 1, 2, 3 needs a code review. And it just helps alert people that this needs to be done, so it doesn't sit there and someone has to ask for a code review.
I've also seen kind of the opposite when somebody opens a PR. The part of the PR title has the ticket, the Jira ticket in it, and Jira's listening for that, and then updates the Jira ticket to let the PM know, like, hey, this is in code review. Here's a link to the PR if you want to go take a look at it. So similar, just kind of the reverse. Couple of ways that we kind of use some automation, newsletter signups and posting those to Slack, right? So we have all of these apps that we're using and these services that we're using day to day that have APIs, and somebody signs up for our newsletter, MailChimp sends a notification to Slack. Slack posted in the chat room like, hey, this person just signed up. Also contact forms and submitting those into your CRM. A lot of our clients use Pardot, which is now owned by Salesforce. So, being able to automate that process of saying like, hey, somebody fills out this form, it goes into your CRM, and then in your CRM, you have automation rules to like send it to this person, send it to that person, send it over here, send it over there. So, I mean, I think a lot of times we think of automation as like a development task or something developers are doing to make their lives easier, but it could also be used to, make day-to-day business tasks easier.
Again, anything that's painful, right? That's
right. Or time consuming.
Or time consuming that doesn't deliver. I see it if it's time consuming and it doesn't deliver value or move anything forward, to help in any meaningful way for someone to deliver value, then try to automate it.
Yep. I mean, I think another thing is anything that's error prone. I mean, I've talked a little bit about, I don't know if I've talked about this on the show before, but my wife works in a very regulated industry. She works in clinical research, and maybe 8 or 9 years ago, she worked for a company that needed a report done, every week on certain tasks that were done during the week. And people just used to use Excel and enter data in different fields and compile stuff. And it would take, each PM would take 8 hours a week to generate these reports. And they were extremely error prone. And so she built a spreadsheet and put in some formulas and basically set it up so that it just takes the data raw and formats it into the correct format. And so a task that was taking, there were maybe 5 or 6 PMs, take each of them 8 hours a week and generate incorrect reports now took, 15 minutes each and was 100% accurate. Well, as accurate as the input data was. And so, I think it took her 3 weeks to build that. That's another situation. So it's not just that if it's painful or time consuming, if it's also like human error is a risk. Automation can really take that risk out.
As much as you can eliminate the human element from tasks, from repetitive tasks, I think that's always a good thing.
Just remember that there's a human element to the automation process. So
Sure. And I think, Mike actually illustrated that perfectly, right? With his like, hey, I don't think this is going to work. And then it did. And you were like, okay, now let's refine it. Like, how do we make it better? How do we make sure it's actually working?
Who automates the automation?
Exactly. So we've talked a little bit about what we can automate. We've talked about, when to consider automating, but how do you prioritize? Because when you first start a project or join a team, many times nothing is automated, or very little is automated. How do you guys kind of think about that, and how do you prioritize what should be tackled first?
I mean, I think it depends on the scenario, right? If you're, like you said, Nick, if you're someone who just say you joined a new team and you saw nothing's automated, what to attack first there is something simple that shows automation delivers value. So it could be, I've added a task that, I've added a GitHub action that lints our code for us and tells us in our PR, like relatively simplistic thing to add. But if you're a team and you're just thinking about what can we do first, think about what is that painful, error-prone task that you do the most, and can you automate that away, like the tasks you need to do for your deployment.
Makes sense. Yeah, I think for me, a lot of the time it's a balancing act between those things. One thing that generally bumps something up in priority for me is how risky an error is. So, for example, I don't think I would launch a new website that doesn't have some sort of automated deployment, because first of all, I've only done automated deployments over the last few years, and so I'm sure there are steps that I would miss if I were to well, actually that's not true, because I could always just look at an automation and see what the steps are. I guess that's the other thing too. Automation provides documentation kind of by default for at least what's happening, if not why. But yeah, if something is high risk, even if it's not something that is done very often, that's something that I definitely look to automate first, because, like John, like you said, I want to take that human element out of it.
Yeah. And if you're talking like with Drupal projects, right? I would say if there's a series of like drush commands that if you don't run them in the right order, like for example, if when you do a release and then you have to run database updates, then configuration imports, if you run it backwards, it doesn't always work correctly. Right? So that's a small error prone thing, but that could cause big ramifications on your site. So if you could build a script around that to do that for you.
So our internal CI pipeline does, on a deploy, does a cache rebuild, does a config import. But going back to the beginning of the show where I was talking about upgrading to Drupal 9 on Pantheon, the Pantheon workflow does not do config import. So the other day, this is a prime example of what you guys are talking about. The other day, I was making an update to my site and I was sitting there like, why isn't this working? Like, why didn't, like, I already deployed it. It says it's done. And I'm like, what is wrong? And then I'm like, the config didn't import. I go, okay. So then I got to run a command from my terminal to say, hey, do the config import. So, now based on, Nick's suggestion, I could set a shortcut in my terminal that would allow me to push to Pantheon and do the config import, without having to write the two different commands. But it's interesting because I'm so used to that happening for me. When it doesn't happen, you're kind of like, what?
I do need to clarify that the pushing directly to the production tag in Pantheon is not a generally supported or generally recommended process. It's just more of a technically possible. Like I've done it once or twice, like on test sites, but it's not something that I would I don't want people taking that as a recommendation and saying, well, Nick recommended that we push directly to the production tag. Because you don't want to be doing that, but you do certainly want to automate that config import workflow if you can. And I think, Pantheon uses Quicksilver to do that. Because, although I know that's been that sometimes doesn't fire either. It's kind of finicky.
Yeah, I just use the terminus command out of my Lambda environment personally, but anyway.
I have
the way to do it.
And I have in Circle CI where it's interesting for our deployment. We do it based on the semantic versioning of our code base. So we have a job that's looking for a tag following semantic versioning, and it triggers all this stuff, and then it runs terminus commands to like do the database import, run config import, clear the cache, clear the environment cache, all that stuff. So someone on my team used to have to do that like every day. And it would take them like an hour to do. So
I immediately just felt sad for that person.
Yeah, and the thing is, you do it in the wrong order, like we've been talking about. That's a high risk thing. You do it in the wrong order, you break some stuff.
Yep.
And so automating that, it might take, something more complex like that, especially something that's already in production. That can take some time to automate. But that's, in my book, that would be probably not the first thing I would tackle, but one of the first things I would tackle. Yep. I really like your suggestion of finding something that proves the value of automation. Because making a big change like that, there's high risk there too. Like if there's 10 or 15 steps that the person has to take, well, maybe there's a step that they have to take sometimes and they forgot to tell you about it. So you write this automation and you encounter some sort of deploy that requires rebuilding Solar. And you didn't automate that because they didn't tell you, because they hadn't had a deployment that needed that for a while. And then 3 weeks after the automation, one of those types of things goes up, the automation doesn't take care of it, and all of a sudden search is broken on the site. And so you don't want that to be the first thing you automate, because you want to make sure there's no gaps. But or at least if there is a gap, that they understand automation at that point, and you can remediate that.
So we've mentioned a bunch of tools and services you can use for automating related to Drupal, and I mean there's a bunch of them I could list. And it all depends on your setup, right? There's Jenkins. People still use it. Circle CI is a big one. Bitbucket pipelines, Acquia pipelines, GitHub Actions, Azure DevOps, Bash scripts, Jira Actions. I think it all depends on the provider you're using for your hosting, the code repository where you're hosting that, and then it could even be what your organization allows in terms of like technology and security. So pretty much though, if you're in Drupal, you're using at least one of these services, and so they're available for you to start setting up automated tasks.
It's interesting. So the automations that, there are free and paid services out there, and the automations that I was talking about before with like the newsletter sign up posting to Slack and the contact form going into your CRM. We actually use Zapier to do that. We relaunched our website using Gatsby, and one of the things that kind of broke was our web forms going into our CRM solution. So I was able to very quickly, without any help from our development team, spin up Zapier and get the integration from our Gatsby website or a Netlify forms submission pushed into our CRM. So, I think that's something to think about too, that again, they don't always have to be like super developer focused or even really include a developer sometimes.
Sure.
Yeah, I would say if you're looking to automate something, especially deployments or some sort of CI, try out a couple of tools. They're all very different. People will have different preferences. And some of them have different strengths and weaknesses. Jenkins is good for all around like automating tasks. Basically, it's kind of like a cron runner with the UI. And it's very, very different than Circle CI or pipelines or actions. So yeah, try a couple out, see what works for you. It's definitely, there's definitely a large variety of options. You're not gonna run out of options to choose from. So let's take a quick second and talk about what kind of skills you need. Stephen kind of hinted at it earlier in the show, but when you're looking to automate something, or looking for somebody to automate something for you, what kind of skills should you be looking for?
Let me say, as someone who's spent the last year getting better at automation and writing these things, to kind of take that burden from my team, what you need, is helpful can be like a understanding of Bash and like Bash scripting, because all these are kind of based on that. But then having time, just what's really required for skills is being able to think through the workflow of something and working with your team to think that through, and then dedicate yourself to reading the documentation for whatever your tool you're using and watching videos to learn it. It's really just, perseverance, grit.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think Bash is a good one. Patience. Yeah. And perseverance are definitely needed too. Cause most automations, you're not going to get it right the first time, second time. And in some cases, you'll almost be there and you'll find some variable that means, I got to rewrite it from scratch again.
Yeah. Yeah. You have to be okay with failure. Like,
the willingness to try and try again, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So we have a note in here: in-house versus outsourcing automations. Now, personally, I would think that you wouldn't ever really want to outsource your automation, like developing your automations, because you want to be very familiar with how those work. Mike, do you have any insight into that?
I mean, I feel the same way. I'd want my team to control our automation. However, it depends on your setup. It could be if you want to get something set up, like, you want this task automated and it's never going to change. You could outsource someone to set it up for you initially and provide you documentation with what they did, and then you take it over from there. Or like outsourcing like the skills to think through what can be automated and how. That could be somebody you don't need full time to hire. You just hire someone like a contractor to figure that out for you and then work from there. Or
if you have the ability to automate, but just don't have the time resources. So you have the ability to look at what somebody's doing and know that it's going to work. Sometimes just getting some additional workload there is helpful too.
Yep.
So last but not least, maintaining your automations, right? So you build all these great automations. Things are happening automatically. You're sitting up with your feet on your desk. How often should you look at maintaining your automations or going in and doing testing? And Mike, I think you said you run an automated test of your site every night, but like that doesn't necessarily test your automations themselves. Right?
No, it doesn't. Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things. I think it's like kind of part of like setting aside time for like tech debt, right? It depends on the size of your organization and your group. Like, you may not need a dedicated DevOps person who's constantly working on this, but it could be you have Jira tasks where your build could be done faster. It could be done a little better. So set aside time in your sprint and have someone, if they have downtime, take it on and try it out.
I think there's a couple of different places. One is like that, what Mike said, like making it more efficient, especially if you're paying for some cycle somewhere. But I actually just had a situation 2 days ago where I have an automated deployment for a client, and it's very robust. It's worked great for 3 years. And this Wednesday I did a deployment, and the site didn't go down, but it did the thing where sometimes caches get out of sync and none of the styles loaded. And so I did a little bit, I fixed it, cleared the cache, dumped varnish, did some research, and realized the reason was that site usually gets deployed once every week or two. But we've been working on something else for the past month. And so it hasn't been deployed in a month. And so the Drupal cache got very large. So when it deployed and cleared cache, the varnish process queue got very large, which meant that it took time for that to process. And I realized that the automation, like the deployment, didn't just dump the entire varnish cache. It just relied on the Drupal processing queue to handle. And that's been fine for, if it deploys every 2 to 3 weeks. But when that cache gets very large, it's a hole. So I need to perform some automation maintenance there. I have to set up the automation to dump the entire varnish cache. But also there's efficiencies.
it's important, right? So it's important to do it because ultimately someday you're going to find out that your automation needs maintenance because something's not going to do what it's supposed to do.
Some new feature or some version update breaks something.
That happened in my group with the way we're running our automated BHAT tests is something stopped working. And so I had to spend the last week and a half rebuilding how we set that up just because things have changed. Composer was updated to version 2. So I think that's another piece of doing maintenance when you're making big changes, like for you, John, right? Upgrading from Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 would be a prime time to revise. If you had automation around your site, you'd want to revise it for, does it work for Drupal 9? So.
Do you have any questions or feedback? You can reach out to us on Twitter at Talking Drupal. You can reach out to us on the Talking Drupal channel on the Drupal Slack, or you can email us at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can always get show updates by signing up for our newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And don't forget, you can promote your Drupal camp on Talking Drupal. You can learn more about that at talkingdrupal.com/camp promo.
Thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support's greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing the Become a Patron button in the sidebar.
And John, if our listeners wanted to get in touch with you, how would they do that?
You can get in touch with me at John Picozzi on all the major social networks, and Oomph Inc. is hiring. So if you need a job or you're looking to switch positions, go to oomphinc.com/careers.
And Mike Miles, if our listeners want to reach out to you, what would be the best way?
Yeah, major social networks at Mike Miles 86, on Drupal and Twitter, and my website, mike-miles.com, or my podcast website, developingup.com.
And listeners can get in touch with me at NixVan pretty much everywhere, NICXVAN, and Stephen is on stephencross.com.
That's ST with a PHEN s.com.
I'm just going to let that sit. Let that
and
marinate
as always,
for a second.
If you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.
Thanks, guys. See you
later.
next week.
Bye.